Photo from 1920. Young couple seems happy until they notice the mark on his neck. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Detroit Historical Museum's conservation lab, illuminating specks of dust that danced in the air. Dr. Emma Richardson carefully lifted another photograph from the estate donation box. This one, protected by a deteriorating envelope marked 1920, private. She slid the image free with practiced care. A wedding portrait. The couple stood close together in what appeared to be a modest photography studio, a painted backdrop of flowers behind them. The young man was black, perhaps 25 years old, wearing a suit that looked new but inexpensive. Beside him stood a white woman of similar age, her dress simple but elegant, her hand resting lightly in his. What struck Emma immediately was how rare this photograph was. In 1920, interracial marriage was illegal in over 30 states. The few couples who defied these laws did so at tremendous risk, often fleeing to northern states where such unions were technically legal but socially devastating. The couple's expressions were serious, almost defiant. There was no manufactured joy for the camera, no performative happiness. Instead, their faces showed determination, perhaps even fear barely concealed behind resolved expressions. Emma positioned the photograph under her high-resolution scanner. Over her 15-year career restoring historical images, she had developed an instinct for photographs that held secrets. This one practically vibrated with untold stories. The machine hummed as it captured every microscopic detail. Emma pulled up the digital file and began her systematic examination, zooming in section by section. The woman's dress showed careful needlework, likely homemade. The man's suit had been pressed with precision. The tie knotted perfectly. These were people who had dressed with great care for this moment, knowing it might be the only formal photograph they would ever have. She moved to their faces. The woman's jaw was set with determination, her eyes looking directly at the camera with an almost challenging gaze. The man's expression was harder to read, pride mixed with something else, wariness perhaps, or the exhaustion of someone who had survived something terrible. Emma zoomed in on his neck, just above the crisp white collar of his shirt. Her breath caught. There, partially visible above the fabric, was a mark, a scar, deliberately made in the shape of the letter P, with a line through it. The tissue was raised and discolored, the kind of scarring that came from a brand burned deep into skin. Emma sat back from her screen, her heart pounding. She had seen similar marks in photographs from the antebellum period, the brands that enslavers burned into the flesh of enslaved people to mark them as property. But this photograph was from 1920. 55 years after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. She leaned forward again, examining the scar more closely. It was old, but not ancient. The tissue had the appearance of a wound inflicted in childhood, perhaps 10 to 15 years before this photograph was taken, around 1905 to 1910, 3 decades after slavery officially ended. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she flipped the envelope over. Written in faded pencil, Thomas and Margaret, married Detroit, June 1920. Do not show family. Do not show family. She opened her database and began searching. Interracial marriages, Detroit, 1920, illegal labor practices, convict leasing, peonage. The results that populated made her stomach turn. Emma spent the next 3 days immersed in historical records that most people preferred to forget. The comfortable narrative of American history suggested that slavery ended in 1865 with the 13th Amendment. The reality was far more complex and far more brutal. She discovered that the 13th Amendment contained a critical loophole. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. That single phrase, except as a punishment for crime, had been weaponized across the South to recreate slavery under different names. The convict leasing system allowed states to arrest black men and boys for minor or invented offenses, vagrancy, loitering, not having proof of employment, and then lease them to private companies, plantations, and mines. The conditions were often worse than slavery had been because the companies had no financial investment in keeping the workers alive. When a convict died, they simply leased another one. But there was something even more insidious that Emma uncovered: debt peonage. In isolated rural areas across the Deep South, plantation owners and lumber companies created systems of perpetual debt. They would hire black workers, then charge them inflated prices for housing, food, and tools. The workers could never pay off their debts, and attempting to leave was treated as theft, a crime that resulted in arrest and convict leasing, or worse, vigilante justice. Children born into these systems inherited their parents' debts. They were marked, tracked, and trapped. Emma found a report from 1903 written by a journalist named Mary Grace Quackenboss, who had investigated peonage operations in Florida. One passage made Emma's blood run cold. In the turpentine camps of northern Florida, I witnessed children as young as 5 years old working alongside their parents. Many bore marks burned into their skin, letters or symbols indicating which company owned their family's debt. When I asked about these brands, I was told they prevented workers from escaping to other camps. A child marked with one company's symbol could not claim to work for another. The practice is illegal, but local sheriffs are paid to look the other way. Emma pulled up the photograph again, zooming in on Thomas's neck. The P with a line through it, a company mark. A brand of ownership burned into a child's skin sometime between 1900 and 1910. She needed to find out what that symbol meant. Dr. Marcus Webb, her colleague and the museum's expert on industrial history, arrived within the hour. Emma showed him the photograph and the mark. Marcus studied it in silence, his expression growing darker. Finally, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his research files. "I've seen this mark before," he said quietly. "It's from the Piedmont Lumber Company, which operated in southern Georgia and northern Florida from 1898 to 1912. They ran several labor camps that were investigated multiple times for peonage violations, but the local authorities always claimed they found no evidence of wrongdoing." He pulled up a scanned document, a Department of Justice investigation from 1908. Federal agents raided one of Piedmont's camps in 1908. They found over 200 workers, including 43 children, living in conditions described as worse than slavery. The workers were kept in locked barracks at night, forced to work 16-hour days, beaten for failing to meet quotas, and prevented from leaving by armed guards. "What happened?" Emma asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Nothing. The company claimed all the workers were there voluntarily, paying off debts they had willingly incurred. The workers were too terrified to testify against the company. The case was dropped." Piedmont continued operating for 4 more years until a fire destroyed their main camp in 1912, killing 37 workers who were locked inside the barracks. Marcus zoomed in on a photograph included in the Department of Justice report. It showed a group of workers, many of them children, standing in front of a lumber mill. Several had visible marks on their necks, arms, and hands. "They branded them," Emma whispered. "Like cattle." "Like property," Marcus corrected. "Because to Piedmont Lumber Company, that's exactly what these people were. The 13th Amendment might have abolished slavery, but these companies found ways around it, and they operated openly, with the full knowledge and often the active cooperation of local law enforcement for decades after the Civil War." Emma knew she needed more than historical context. She needed to find out who Thomas was, where he came from, and how he ended up in Detroit in 1920 with a brand on his neck and a white wife whose family didn't want to see their wedding photograph. The envelope had provided one crucial piece of information: the couple's first names and the location of their marriage. She started with Detroit marriage records from 1920. It took several hours of searching through digitized records, but she finally found it. Thomas Freeman, age 25, colored, born Georgia Margaret O'Brien, age 23, white, born Michigan, married. June 15, 1920, Wayne County, Michigan. The marriage license included one additional detail. Thomas had listed his occupation as factory worker and his previous residence as Florida. Georgia birth, Florida residence, Detroit marriage. The geography told its own story, a migration northward, away from something. Emma searched for Thomas Freeman in census records. She found him in the 1920 census, enumerated in August, 2 months after his marriage. Thomas Freeman, 25, Negro, married, works in automobile factory. Margaret Freeman, 23, white, married, keeps house, living at 438 Hastings Street, Detroit, Michigan, Hastings Street. Emma knew that address. It was in Paradise Valley, Detroit's historically black neighborhood, where thousands of African Americans had migrated during the Great Migration, seeking work in the automobile factories and escape from Southern violence. She searched backwards. The 1910 census should have captured Thomas at age 15. She searched Georgia first, then expanded to Florida. Nothing. No Thomas Freeman in either state's 1910 census. That absence was significant. Either the name was different, or Thomas hadn't been counted, which was common for people trapped in illegal labor camps that deliberately avoided government enumeration. Emma tried a different approach. She searched newspaper archives for mentions of the Piedmont Lumber Company and labor camp raids. She found dozens of articles from Southern newspapers between 1900 and 1912. Most were brief defensive pieces claiming that reports of peonage were exaggerated by Northern agitators and radical journalists, but a few told different stories. From the Atlanta Constitution, November 1908, federal agents this week raided a labor camp operated by Piedmont Lumber Company in Baker County. The raid followed complaints from relatives of workers who claimed their family members were being held against their will. Among those found at the camp were 15 children, some as young as 6 years old. Company representatives stated that the children were there with their parents, who had voluntarily entered into labor contracts. The investigation is ongoing. From the Jacksonville Times-Union, March 1909. 2 workers from a turpentine camp in Columbia County arrived in Jacksonville last week, having escaped from what they describe as conditions of slavery. The men, who declined to give their names for fear of retaliation, claim they were forced to work without pay and were beaten when they attempted to leave. They bear marks on their bodies they say were inflicted by camp overseers. Local authorities are investigating the claims. Emma searched for any follow-up to these stories. In almost every case, the investigations led nowhere. The workers disappeared, either recaptured and returned to the camps, or too frightened to continue pressing charges. But then she found something different. A report from the Florida Bureau of Labor dated 1911 that included testimony from a raid on a Piedmont camp. Among the workers found at the camp was a boy of approximately 16 years, who gave his name as Thomas. The boy bore a brand mark on his neck, indicating ownership by the company. He stated that he had been brought to the camp at age 7 by his mother, who had been arrested for vagrancy in Valdosta, Georgia. The mother was leased to Piedmont and brought her son with her. She died in 1906. The boy has remained at the camp ever since, told that he must work to pay off his deceased mother's debt. When asked why he did not leave, he stated, "They said if I run, they'll find me and hang me. They showed us what happens to runaways." Emma's hands shook as she read. A 7-year-old boy, branded and trapped, his mother dead, threatened with lynching if he tried to escape. The report continued. The boy was taken into custody by the Bureau and transported to Jacksonville, where efforts are being made to locate any living relatives. In the absence of family, he will be placed in the care of a colored orphanage. But there was no record of what happened next, no follow-up report, no documentation of relatives found or orphanage placement. Thomas had simply vanished from the official record until he reappeared in Detroit in 1920, married and working in a factory, carrying a brand that marked him as someone else's property. Emma needed to understand the other half of the story. Who was Margaret O'Brien, and how had she ended up married to a man who bore the physical evidence of one of America's darkest secrets? She started with the 1900 census, searching for Margaret O'Brien, born around 1897 in Michigan. She found several possibilities, but one stood out. Margaret Rose O'Brien, age 3, living with parents. Patrick O'Brien, immigrant from Ireland, works as factory labor. And Catherine O'Brien, immigrant from Ireland, keeps house in Detroit, Michigan. The family was working class, Irish immigrants who had come to Detroit seeking factory work. Emma traced them through subsequent census records. By 1910, Patrick O'Brien had died. The census listed Catherine as a widow, working as a laundress to support Margaret and 2 younger siblings. By 1920, Margaret was 23 and no longer living with her mother. The census had been taken in January, 5 months before her marriage to Thomas. She was listed as a boarder in a house on Michigan Avenue, working as a secretary in an automobile parts office. Emma searched for any mention of Margaret in Detroit newspapers from that era. She found one entry from the Detroit Free Press social pages, May 1919. Miss Margaret O'Brien of Detroit has been appointed secretary to Mr. Harold Jennings at Motor Parts Manufacturing Company. Miss O'Brien is among the increasing number of young women entering the business world. Emma cross-referenced Harold Jennings. He was the owner of a small automotive parts company that employed about 50 workers, including a significant number of black workers who had migrated from the South during the war years. She found something else in the company records. Thomas Freeman had been hired by Motor Parts Manufacturing Company in February 1919. They had met at work. Emma contacted the Detroit Historical Society and requested access to any surviving records from Motor Parts Manufacturing Company. What she received 2 days later was a treasure trove, employment records, payroll ledgers, and a file of correspondence between Harold Jennings and various social reform organizations. It turned out that Jennings was a Quaker and a supporter of the NAACP. His company was one of the few in Detroit that explicitly hired black workers for positions beyond janitorial staff and paid them the same wages as white workers. This had made him unpopular with other factory owners and some of his white employees, but Jennings had persisted. In the correspondence file, Emma found letters from Jennings to the Detroit Urban League, dated 1919. "I'm writing to inform you of a troubling matter involving one of my employees. Thomas Freeman, a young colored man who came to Detroit last year, has shared with me details of his childhood that I find almost impossible to believe. Yet I have no reason to doubt his truthfulness. He was held in a labor camp in Florida from age 7 to approximately age 18, forced to work in turpentine and timber operations. He bears physical scars from this experience, including a brand mark on his neck. He escaped in 1913 and has been working various jobs throughout the South, eventually making his way to Detroit." The letter continued, detailing Jennings's attempts to gather evidence about the illegal labor camps and connect Thomas with legal aid organizations that might help bring charges against the Piedmont Lumber Company. But a response letter from the Urban League, dated May 1919, was discouraging. "While we appreciate your advocacy on behalf of Mr. Freeman, we must inform you that pursuing legal action against the companies that operated these camps is exceedingly difficult. Most of the camps have closed or changed ownership. Many of the victims are unwilling or unable to testify due to fear of retaliation. The legal system in the South remains hostile to such claims. We recommend that Mr. Freeman focus on building his new life in Detroit rather than attempting to seek justice for past wrongs, painful as that reality may be." Emma knew she needed to find out exactly how Thomas had gotten from that labor camp to Detroit. She contacted Dr. Jennifer Washington, a historian at Wayne State University who specialized in the Great Migration and the experiences of black workers who fled the South. They met at a coffee shop near the university campus. Dr. Washington arrived with a worn leather satchel full of research materials, oral histories, migration records, and documentation of the routes that hundreds of thousands of black Americans had taken northward between 1910 and 1930. "What you're describing fits a pattern I've seen in dozens of oral histories," Dr. Washington said after Emma explained Thomas's story. Young men and boys who escaped from peonage camps, convict leasing operations, or plantation debt systems. They rarely traveled directly north. It was too dangerous. Instead, they moved in stages, working in different cities, changing their names sometimes, always looking over their shoulders. She pulled out a map marked with migration routes. If Thomas escaped from a Piedmont camp in Florida around 1913, he would have been about 18 years old. The camps were guarded, so escape required planning and often help from outside. Some workers escaped during transfers between camps. Others were helped by local black communities or sympathetic white allies, Quakers, some clergy, a few brave journalists. Dr. Washington showed Emma several oral histories she had collected. One was from a man named Robert Hayes, interviewed in 1975, who had escaped from a turpentine camp in Georgia in 1911. "I was 15 when I run. They had us in a camp about 30 miles from any town. At night, they locked us in the barracks, long buildings with no windows, just one door that the foreman padlocked from outside. If there'd been a fire, we all would have died. I knew I had to get out or I'd die there anyway. One night, I waited till everyone was asleep. Then I dug at the floorboards with a piece of metal I'd been hiding for months, made a hole just big enough to squeeze through, crawled under the building and ran into the woods. Took me 3 days to reach a town, walking at night, hiding during the day. A colored preacher there gave me food and let me sleep in his church. He put me on a train heading to Atlanta, told me never to come back to Georgia." The parallels to Thomas's likely experience were clear. Emma found herself imagining an 11 or 12-year-old boy, branded and terrorized, watching for any opportunity to escape the hell he'd been trapped in since childhood. Dr. Washington showed her another document, a report from the National Urban League tracking the movement of black workers from rural South to northern cities between 1910 and 1920. Thousands of young men arrived in cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh during these years with similar stories, Dr. Washington explained. Most of them never spoke publicly about what they'd survived. The trauma was too deep, and there was also real danger. Even in the North, Southern authorities sometimes tried to reclaim escaped peonage workers, claiming they were fugitives from justice or debt criminals. She pulled up a newspaper article from the Chicago Defender, the major black newspaper of the era, dated 1916. "Warning to migrants. Southern agents are operating in Chicago, Detroit, and other northern cities, attempting to lure colored workers back south with false promises of high wages. These agents are working on behalf of plantation owners and labor camps, seeking to reclaim workers who fled peonage conditions. Do not trust any offers that seem too good to be true. Do not provide information about your previous residence in the South. If approached by suspicious individuals, report immediately to the Urban League or local police." Emma felt the weight of what Thomas must have lived with, the constant fear of being found, recaptured, sent back to the hell he'd escaped. Emma returned to the photograph, studying it with new understanding. Thomas stood straight-backed, his expression carefully neutral, wearing a suit that represented months of savings. Margaret beside him, her hand touching his, her face showing determination that bordered on defiance. This wasn't just a wedding portrait. It was an act of resistance. In 1920, Michigan was one of the few northern states that didn't explicitly prohibit interracial marriage, but that didn't mean such unions were accepted. Emma found newspaper articles documenting the harassment that interracial couples faced in Detroit during this period. From the Detroit News, August 1920, "A colored man and white woman residing on Hastings Street have been repeatedly threatened by anonymous letters demanding they leave the neighborhood. Police have been notified, but state they cannot act on anonymous threats. The woman's family has reportedly disowned her." Emma couldn't confirm this article referred to Thomas and Margaret, but the timing and location matched. She found Margaret's mother, Catherine O'Brien, in the 1920 census, still living in Detroit with Margaret's younger siblings. In the 1930 census, Catherine was still listed as living with her other children, but Margaret was notably absent from the household. Mother and daughter had apparently not reconciled. Emma searched for any record of children born to Thomas and Margaret. She found 2 birth certificates. James Freeman, born March 1921, parents Thomas Freeman, colored, and Margaret Freeman, white. Catherine Freeman, born November 1923, parents Thomas Freeman, colored, and Margaret Freeman, white. Both children were classified as colored on their birth certificates, following the one-drop rule that defined anyone with any African ancestry as black, regardless of their actual appearance. Emma found the family in the 1930 census, still living in Detroit. Thomas Freeman, 35, works in an automobile factory. Margaret Freeman, 33, keeps house James Freeman, 9, in school Catherine Freeman, 6, in school. They were still together, still living in Paradise Valley, still raising their children in a city that didn't fully accept them. Emma wanted to know what had happened to them after 1930. She searched through census records, city directories, and death certificates. Thomas Freeman died in 1954, age 59, of heart disease. His obituary in the Michigan Chronicle, Detroit's black newspaper, was brief. Thomas Freeman, longtime employee of Ford Motor Company and resident of Detroit for 35 years, passed away at his home on Monday. He is survived by his wife, Margaret, son James, daughter Catherine, and 4 grandchildren. Services will be held at Bethel AME Church. Margaret lived until 1968, dying at age 71. Her obituary mentioned her children and grandchildren, but made no mention of her Irish family. Whatever breach had occurred when she married Thomas had apparently never healed. But Emma found something else in the death notices. Obituaries for James Freeman, died 1989, and Catherine Freeman, now Catherine Williams, died 2003. Both had lived long lives, had children of their own, had been part of Detroit's black community. Thomas and Margaret's act of defiance in 1920 had created a family, a legacy that continued. Emma knew she needed to find living descendants. She started with the grandchildren mentioned in Thomas and Margaret's obituaries and worked forward through public records. She found contact information for David Freeman, grandson of Thomas and Margaret, age 67, living in suburban Detroit. She sent a carefully worded email explaining her research and asking if he would be willing to share family stories. His response came the next day. Dear Dr. Richardson, I've been waiting 30 years for someone to ask about my grandparents' story. Yes, I would very much like to meet with you. They met at David's home in Southfield, a comfortable house filled with family photographs. David was a retired teacher, tall and dignified, with his grandfather's serious eyes and his grandmother's determined jaw. He led Emma to his study, where he had prepared a box of family materials, photographs, letters, and documents that had been passed down through generations. My father, James, didn't talk much about my grandfather's past, David began. But my grandmother told me stories before she died. She wanted us to know the truth. He pulled out a photograph Emma hadn't seen before. Thomas, as a much older man, probably in the 1940s, sitting in a garden with several children around him. His collar was open, and the brand on his neck was clearly visible. Grandma Margaret said that when she first met Grandpa at the factory, she noticed he always wore high collars, even in summer. She thought he was just formal. But one day, it was so hot, he rolled up his sleeves and loosened his collar, and she saw the mark. She asked him about it. David paused, his voice growing thick. He told her he'd been marked like an animal when he was a child, that white men had done it to make sure he couldn't run away. He said there were hundreds of other children in those camps, all of them trapped, all of them forgotten. When Grandma asked why he'd never reported it, he said, "Who would believe a black man's word against white men's property records?" Emma felt tears welling in her eyes. Your grandmother believed him. More than believed him. She fell in love with him. And when he asked her to marry him, she knew what it would cost. Her family told her she'd be disowned. Her mother said she was throwing her life away. Her priest refused to perform the ceremony, but Grandma Margaret said she'd rather be married to an honest man who'd survived hell than live a comfortable lie with her family's approval. David pulled out a letter, yellowed with age, written in neat, feminine handwriting. My dearest mother, I know you cannot accept my marriage to Thomas. I know you believe I have disgraced our family, but I have to tell you what you refuse to hear. The man I married was stolen from his childhood and marked like cattle. He survived things that would have killed weaker men. He built a life from nothing. He's kind, hardworking, and honest. If you cannot see his worth because of the color of his skin, then it is you who have disgraced yourself, not me. I will always be your daughter, but I will not apologize for loving a good man. Margaret. The letter was dated July 1920, 1 month after the wedding. It had been returned unopened. My grandmother kept it her whole life, David said. I asked her once why she kept a letter her mother never read. She said, because I needed to remember that I was brave once, that I stood up for what was right, even when it cost me everything. David shared more family stories that Margaret had told him before her death in 1968. Thomas had rarely spoken about his years in the labor camp, but late in life, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, he had begun sharing fragments of his experience. He told my father that there were boys in the camps who died of exhaustion, malnutrition, beatings, David said. Some were as young as 5 or 6 years old. The company would report their deaths as accidents or natural causes, but everyone knew the truth. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves in the woods around the camps. David pulled out a document Thomas had written in the 1950s after seeing news coverage of the emerging civil rights movement. It was several pages of handwritten testimony detailing his experiences. My name is Thomas Freeman, but that is not the name I was born with. I was born Thomas Washington in Valdosta, Georgia, in 1895. My mother's name was Sarah Washington. We were free people, but in the South, after slavery, being free didn't mean you were safe. When I was 7 years old, my mother was arrested for vagrancy. We had been living on the edge of town, and my mother did washing for white families. But the sheriff said she didn't have proper employment papers. They took her to the county courthouse and sentenced her to 6 months' labor to pay her fine. She was leased to the Piedmont Lumber Company. They let her bring me with her because I was too young to be left alone. When we arrived at the camp, I understood we had been sold back into slavery, even though slavery was supposed to be over. The camp was surrounded by woods, miles from any town. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. At night, they locked us in wooden barracks. During the day, we worked in the turpentine forests and lumber mills. Children worked alongside adults. If you didn't meet your quota, you were beaten. When I was 8 years old, the camp foreman branded me. He heated an iron in the fire until it glowed red, then pressed it into my neck while 2 other men held me down. He said it was so everyone would know I belonged to Piedmont. He said if I ever ran away, any sheriff in 3 states would see that mark and send me back. My mother died when I was 11. They said it was fever, but I think it was despair. After she died, they told me I had inherited her debt. I would have to work until it was paid off. The debt never got smaller, only larger. They charged us for food, for the barracks, for the tools we used. You could work your whole life and never pay it off. I stayed in that camp for 11 more years. I saw boys die of heat stroke, of infections, of beatings. I saw men hanged for trying to escape. I survived by becoming invisible, by never complaining, by doing exactly what I was told. In 1913, when I was 18, a fire broke out in one of the mills. In the confusion, I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just away. I ran for 3 days through swamps and forests, terrified they would catch me and hang me like they'd done to others. I made it to Jacksonville, where a colored minister took me in. He gave me new clothes, burned the ones I'd been wearing, and told me to never go back to Georgia or Florida. He said there were places up north where a man could work and be free. He helped me get on a train to Atlanta, then Birmingham, then Memphis, then Chicago, then finally Detroit. I changed my last name from Washington to Freeman. It felt like claiming something that had been stolen from me. I met Margaret at the factory in 1919. She was the first white person who ever looked at me like I was fully human. When I told her about the camp, about the brand, she cried. Then she got angry. She wanted to go to the police, to the newspapers, to make someone pay for what had been done to me and the others. But I told her there was no justice for people like me. The camps were gone or had changed names. The men who ran them were respected businessmen. Who would believe a black man with a slave brand on his neck over white men with money and connections? So instead, we got married. It was the only kind of justice I could have. Building a life, having children, being free to love who I wanted. Every day I wake up next to Margaret is a day I win. Every day I watch my children grow up safe is a day I beat the men who tried to steal my life. I'm writing this because someone needs to know what happened in those camps. Thousands of us were trapped there. Men, women, children. Most didn't escape. Most died without anyone knowing their names or stories. If you're reading this, please remember them. Remember that slavery didn't end in 1865. It just changed its name. Emma read the document 3 times, tears streaming down her face. This was the testimony that needed to be heard, the truth that had been buried for over a century. Emma spent the next 4 months preparing an exhibition for the Detroit Historical Museum. She called it Marked Slavery After Emancipation. Thomas and Margaret's story formed the centerpiece. But Emma had discovered dozens of similar cases through her research. She worked with Dr. Washington and other historians to document the systems of convict leasing, peonage, and debt slavery that had trapped hundreds of thousands of black Americans between 1865 and 1945. She included photographs of labor camps, copies of legal documents showing how the systems operated, testimony from survivors and their descendants. The exhibition opened on a cold February evening in 2025. The gallery was filled with community members, historians, descendants of victims, and journalists. David Freeman stood before the enlarged photograph of his grandparents, his own children and grandchildren beside him. The photograph that had been hidden for generations with the note, "Do not show family," was now displayed for the world to see. Emma had arranged the exhibition to walk visitors through the full story. First, the comfortable myth. Slavery ended in 1865 and black Americans became free. Then, the reality. The 13th Amendment's loophole, the deliberate re-enslavement through legal trickery, the camps, the brands, the forgotten children. Thomas's photograph was displayed prominently, zoomed in to show the brand on his neck. Beside it, his handwritten testimony, his words bearing witness to what he had survived. But the exhibition didn't end with trauma. The final section showed Thomas and Margaret's life in Detroit, their children, their grandchildren, the family they built through love and defiance. Photographs showed Thomas working at Ford Motor Company, serving as a deacon at his church, teaching his grandchildren to read. Photographs showed Margaret volunteering at the Detroit Urban League, marching in civil rights demonstrations in the 1960s, standing proud beside her husband at their 40th wedding anniversary. The exhibition included video interviews with David and other descendants, sharing family stories that had been passed down through generations. Dr. Washington gave the opening speech, standing before Thomas's photograph. For too long, we have told ourselves a comforting story about American freedom, that slavery ended with the 13th Amendment, that black Americans were liberated in 1865, that what came after was simply the long, difficult work of achieving equality. But the truth is far more disturbing. Slavery didn't end. It evolved. It adapted. It found new names and new legal justifications, and it continued in camps and chain gangs and debt prisons for decades after emancipation. Thomas Freeman was one of hundreds of thousands of children who grew up in the system of neo-slavery. He was branded like property. He was told he was owned. He watched other children die in those camps. And when he finally escaped, he had to live in constant fear that someone would send him back. But Thomas didn't just survive. He built a life. He found love. He raised children who raised children who raised children. His great-great-grandchildren are here tonight, living proof that freedom, once claimed, cannot be taken back. This exhibition asks us to remember what we'd rather forget. It asks us to see the brand on Thomas's neck not as a curiosity from the past, but as evidence of a crime that went unpunished. And it asks us what we owe to the thousands who didn't escape, whose names we'll never know, who died in those camps and were buried in unmarked graves. We owe them the truth. We owe them remembrance. We owe them the work of making sure such systems can never exist again. 3 months after the exhibition opened, Emma received an email from the Department of Justice. The exhibition had caught the attention of the Civil Rights Division, which was undertaking a comprehensive review of post-emancipation labor practices as part of a broader reckoning with America's racial history. They wanted to use Thomas's testimony and Emma's research as part of an official investigation into the Piedmont Lumber Company and similar operations. While the perpetrators were long dead and criminal prosecution was impossible, the government was preparing a formal acknowledgement of these crimes and exploring possibilities for descendant compensation. Emma also heard from the Florida Department of State. Using the information from her research, archaeologists and historians were planning to excavate the sites of former labor camps, looking for the unmarked graves Thomas had mentioned in his testimony. They hoped to identify and properly memorialize the children and adults who had died in those camps. David Freeman was invited to testify before a congressional committee examining the legacy of slavery and its continuation through other systems. He brought his grandfather's handwritten testimony and the wedding photograph, placing them on the table before the assembled representatives. "My grandfather wore high collars his entire life," David told the committee. Even in photographs with his family, even at his grandchildren's baptisms, even in his casket. He was ashamed of that brand, ashamed that someone had marked him like an animal, but he shouldn't have been the one carrying shame. The shame belongs to the system that created those camps, to the men who profited from stolen labor, to the authorities who looked the other way, to a society that pretended it wasn't happening. My grandfather died in 1954, still carrying that brand, still afraid sometimes that someone would come for him. He never got justice. But maybe we can create something like justice for all the others who didn't escape, whose stories were never told, whose names we'll never know. Start by telling the truth. That's what Grandma Margaret always said. Start by telling the truth and then figure out what comes next. Emma continued her research, now funded by a major foundation grant. She had identified over 300 photographs similar to Thomas and Margaret's. Images of people bearing brands, scars, and other physical evidence of post-emancipation slavery. Each photograph was a story waiting to be told, a witness to crimes that had been hidden for generations. She created a digital archive, making all the photographs and testimony available to researchers, descendants, and the public. The archive was called Marked Evidence of Slavery After Emancipation, and it grew daily as people contributed family photographs and stories. One afternoon, Emma received a package from a woman in Atlanta. Inside was a photograph from 1918 and a letter. "Dear Dr. Richardson, I saw your exhibition online. This is my great-grandfather Samuel in 1918. You can see the mark on his hand, a brand from a convict labor camp in Alabama where he was sent at age 14 for loitering. He served 3 years of hard labor for standing on a street corner. He escaped during a transfer and made it to Atlanta, where he lived for 60 more years. He never talked about those 3 years, but he never forgot them either. Please include his story in your archive. His name should be remembered. Sincerely, Patricia Mitchell." Emma carefully scanned the photograph and added it to the archive, along with Patricia's letter. Samuel's face stared out at her, young, determined, marked, but not broken. She returned to the original photograph of Thomas and Margaret, now on permanent display at the museum. The young couple looked back at her, their expressions serious and defiant, their hands joined, their lives intertwined. The photograph that had been hidden for generations with instructions not to show the family was now seen by thousands of visitors each month, and visitors no longer saw just a wedding portrait. They saw what Emma had seen when she first zoomed in on that mark on Thomas's neck. Evidence, testimony, truth. The brand that had been meant to mark Thomas's property had instead become proof of a crime, a witness to a history that America had tried to forget, and a reminder that freedom is never fully won. It must be fought for, protected, and remembered in every generation.